Slavery is one of the darkest pages in the history of mankind, and at the same time, a thing that was commonplace throughout 99% of history. It is true that up to the New Age, the system of slavery looked very different, and we will talk about it in the next couple of minutes, at the same time going through the main stereotypes, myths, and inaccuracies associated with the history of slavery. Globally, it can be divided into two stages. The first is everything that happened before 1619. The second is everything that happened after. It just so happened that it was the trade of black Africans in Europe and America. Nowadays, there is an opinion that enslavement of some people to others began simultaneously with the emergence of Homo sapiens as such, because violence and control of others is sewn into our DNA as well as the love of food. There is archaeological evidence of the presence of slavery in the time of hunter-gatherers. However, it is traditionally believed that the industrialization of slavery began at the same time as the birth of agriculture. That is about 11,000 years ago. It is understandable. The Neolithic Revolution allowed people to gather in large cities, forget about hunting, and grow food in the fields territory of present-day Iraq and Iran. Between 4 and 8. 0 years ago, by this time slavery was already legally regulated at a high level. The laws of the Sumerian king Ur-Nammu, written around 2100 BC, is considered to be the oldest surviving law as such, and it clearly divides society into free people and slaves. There are many small laws regulating the relationship between the two categories. For example, if a slave married a free man, the couple was obliged to give their firstborn child to the former master as a slave for violence against a slave. There was a monetary fine for the return of runaway slaves. There was a reward, and for violence on the part of a slave, there was a punishment in the form of feeding the guilty 1 quart of salt. The mechanism of granting freedom to slaves was also regulated, which indicates a high degree of bureaucratization of ancient societies. The same can be said about Egypt, where slaves were also plentiful, and the legislative framework was even more seriously regulated. The list of jobs where slaves could be employed, as well as completely prohibited markets for buying and selling. All transactions related to slaves were controlled by the government, and having slave property was not prohibited, and legally they were considered the youngest members of the owner's family. Egypt was greatly exaggerated by scholars living during slavery in the United States. Nowadays, nobody thinks that the Great Pyramids were built by slaves. Rather, on the contrary, historians hint more and more loudly that it is time to stop branding all cultures of antiquity indiscriminately as slavery, because at least the Egyptian system of slavery was more like the most ordinary relations of the upper and lower strata of the population, which did not go anywhere. And now, summarizing the topic of antiquity, we will add that the vast majority of slaves in those times were debtors. Farmers, peasants, and the lower strata of society consciously chose slavery to avoid death from hunger or the harsh hand of collectors. Also, a significant category of slaves were prisoners of war who, in general, also and often of their own free will, served the new masters to avoid even more rapid death. The next, and perhaps the most famous stage in the history of slavery, were ancient Greece and Rome. It is believed that these civilizations borrowed the entire mechanism of slavery from the Sumerians, and on the other hand, from them slavery moved to the Chinese in Deep Asia. In East Asia, the first records of slaves appear only in the 2nd century BC during the Qin dynasty of China. As for Greece and Rome, slavery first became an economic engine during the reign of Pericles in the 5th century BC. 35% of the population of Athens were slaves, and the legendary Plato and Aristotle called slavery an integral part of slavery. Slavery is an integral part of any civilized community and a natural process. Even the Bible approves of slavery, both Old and New Testaments, except that they ask the owners of their slaves not to punish them too much. But there are a couple of nuances to compare the modern slavery concept with the modern slavery concept, the process of accepting it. Slave into the family. For example, in Greece was almost identical to the ceremony for newborns, to have a domestic slave who loves his family and is de facto a member of it. In fact, the modern word pedagogue is a reference to a house slave who taught children and was not offensive, even in ancient times, slaves throughout. Greece and Rome were often buried directly in family vaults, and in the Odyssey, the slave of the protagonist notices a small scar on his thigh, which hints at a very close relationship between them. Couple, of course, house slaves could be beaten, thrown out on the street, and in times of financial crises, it was they who lost food and a roof over their heads first of all. Still, by the standards of history, domestic slaves felt fine, but who really had it bad was the agricultural and industrial. Slaves, these two categories of laborers, were really considered expendable. Their mortality rate was in the region of 50%, mainly prisoners of war, criminals, and just unlucky people. And there can be no discount here. In Rome, this category of slaves were generally chained at night so that they would not run away. But we should not forget about the last and very important category of slaves in the ancient era. The so-called chorus and kundus slaves who lived separately from their masters, and here the range of activities is huge. Such slaves were found both on construction sites and on ships as captains. There are records of slaves who were shopkeepers and even banker slaves who had serious wealth. Of course, everything belonged to their master, but it is easy to guess that it was not very sensible for the master to beat a slave whose head earned him a fortune. It was these categories of slaves who most often gained their freedom simply because the invisible hand of the market worked long before. The term capitalism was invented. Greece and Rome are perfect examples that slavery is not the hallmark of backward states. In fact, almost all economically strong civilizations of antiquity actively use slavery. Just compare it with slavery in the epic of colonialism. It is not worth comparing it with slavery in the epic of colonialism. Antique societies were too complex, and the fact that unlike their colleagues from ancient Rome, they are not slaves on paper. The slavery system existed in the same form until 1619. It did not care about the color of the skin, religion, and human anatomy. Anyone could be a slave and at the same time a free man too. An African man, Septimius Sever, quietly became emperor of Rome, and the former slaves who rose on the sale of wine built a mansion in Pompeii House of Divinity, which is now a popular tourist attraction. The paradigm of thinking of mankind changed when at the end of August 1619 on the ship White Lion in Virginia brought about 30 African slaves. This gave birth to the large-scale transatlantic slave trade. In general terms, everyone is familiar with slavery in the United States. So here we will talk about the nuances. The first and most important is that slavery as an institution Europeans did not invent, and even more, when Christopher Columbus in 1492 landed in the Bahamas, the local tribe Tianu asked him to help with aggressive representatives of the neighboring tribe of the Caribbean, who took Tianu into slavery. The same with Africa. Those Africans who were brought from Congo to Virginia in 1619 were not sold into slavery by Europeans. Europeans simply bought slaves from the locals. Raids to find slaves were organized by the Old World in Africa, but 99% of slaves were sold to America by local African kings, warlords, and traders. The second important fact is geography. Only 10% of the total transatlantic slave trade went to North America. 90% of slaves were brought to Central and South America. They were taken there long before 1619. Just documented the best adventure of slaves in the United States. Here is the dominance of this region in literature and culture. The third fact is allegedly uneducated and low productivity of slave labor. In reality, It was slaves who taught the colonizers of both Americas to grow rice and indigo. Also, the first factories in the world were created with slave labor. Sugar factories are considered to be the ancestors of modern industry, and they were first worked in the USA only by slaves, which kind of hints at the good productivity of their labor. Well, the fourth, and perhaps the main fact, is that the Civil War in the USA was connected with slavery. In reality, the question of abolition of slavery had been circulating in America since the beginning of the 19th century. President Lincoln himself, in 1863, directly stated that his goal in the war was not to defeat slavery, but to keep the United States united. Just later, the abolition of slavery was a good line of propaganda promoted by the North. That's how they popularized the history. The culture is now fully embracing the idea that slavery was triumphant. Ironically, contrary to what Netflix is trying to show, white people were the driving force behind the abolition of slavery. But to say that history is over is not quite accurate. At this point, about 40 million people on the planet are still slaves. See you later, friends.